Hello, everyone, and this is a lecture on African American political thought. And this lecture is going to stretch from 1850 to 1915. And the reason why we basically using these time periods is because from 1850 is really the essential awakening of the abolition movement in the United States, with black people taking a major step towards leading the abolition movement with the likes of people like Frederick Douglass. The time signature 1850 is generally called the antebellum period, which essentially means before the Civil War. Antebellum. We end with 1915 because this signifies the death of Booker T. Washington, who we'll talk about in just a moment. But so now you understand these fundamental dates: 1850, the antebellum period, 10 years or so before the Civil War. The Civil War was fought between the North, the Union Army, and the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, who tried to break away from the United States over the issue of slavery. So what we're trying to do then is to chart how black people became politically conscious and active during this time period. Now, you've already had some work in this by looking at the slave petitions, where you've seen how people who are citizens of the British Empire, they are subjects. Now we have an American nation, a maturing American nation, and we're seeing how this is going to be played out. This fundamental idea of black political thought is going to be played out as the country matures. So we know that there are strands of political thought, and we call these strands just areas, but strands is probably a better way of connecting this because these strands are all kind of connected together. The first strand of political thought is the idea of assimilation, and then next, immigration, cultural nationalism, and political nationalism. These are the four strands of political thought from 1850 to 1915. So you need to make yourself aware of those. Now, we're going to talk individually about these, but I'm just going to say just some brief words about these. Now, sometimes you're going to see nuances in thought, particularly between things like cultural nationalism and political nationalism, where at a time the two big proponents of these were W.E.B. Dubois with cultural nationalism and Marcus Garvey with political nationalism. Even though these individuals at times were friendly towards each other and other times they were extremely hostile to each other, these two are born of the same mother, so to speak. Assimilation and immigration are two far-ranging fundamental ideas. One is the belief that America is the home of black people. And what I mean by that is black people in the United States, people of African descent who've gone through slavery, and those people who fundamentally believe that this is not our country and that we ought to leave for varying reasons. But these, in essence, are the four strands or areas of political thought from 1850 to 1915. Now, the first of these is assimilation. And assimilation is just that black people were inherently American, and that America has a promise and a duty as articulated in the U.S. Constitution, and that we have a role to play in America's future. Now, with our work on the U.S. Constitution, and I'm having you look at how the Constitution, in effect, has anything to do with black people, you should then have some fundamental ideas that we talked about earlier, those Enlightenment ideas that were inculcated in the U.S. Constitution, that black people are essentially seeing and saying that we are all human beings, and there are within these fundamental ideas of the Enlightenment, some human rights that we all share, and that makes us fundamentally American. Many people who followed this idea of assimilation believe that America must evolve and black people must evolve with it as well, right? So they were looking at this fundamental idea that Irish were coming over, Germans were coming over, and other groups, and they were assimilating into what we call today a melting pot. Now, the problem with the melting pot, as the immigrationists are going to point out, is that there's one thing that affects black people that didn't affect the Irish and the Germans and the Italians and any other group from Europe that came over, is black skin color. That white Europeans could diminish their Irishness, could diminish their Germanness, could diminish their Italianness and fit into some form of a melting pot and become white people at the expense of black people. Now, these assimilationists are Frederick Douglass, Archibald Grimke, Booker T. Washington, and Thomas T. Fortune. Now, obviously, there's a couple of things that you're just automatically going to see about my list today is that these are heavily male-centered, and make no bones about it. As you know that I always tell you, we live in a racist, sexist, homophobic society. So there are women who are working earnestly in these movements, but of course, men dominate the scene, and we are essentially pushing aside as many women as possible. But there were some laudable people. You're going to see with the abolitionists, Harriet Tubman is an exemplary example of this. But nevertheless, the assimilationists who wrote widely and had some significant influence were these four figures here. And we'll begin with Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave in 1818 in Maryland and who eventually escaped to freedom. Frederick Douglass wrote in his autobiography that he believed that his father was actually a white man. Now, he was arguably the greatest abolitionist, and to a large part because many people, particularly whites, who met him could not believe that he was a slave. How can someone be so articulate, so intelligent, but have born a slave? Because the fundamental thinking at this time period was that black people were too intellectually inferior, were from Africa, that the civilization in Africa was essentially uncivilized. So how could he have been a great orator and a great speaker, great thinker, and been a slave? So he wrote a couple of autobiographies to prove his point. So Frederick Douglass's main particular point is that we black people are Americans, that we have bled for this country, we fought in all of its wars, we built this country, so inherently we need to take our rightful place here in America. The next great assimilationist is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington himself also was born a slave in Alabama. He was born in 1856 and, as I stated earlier, would perish in 1915 from high blood pressure. He founded a normal school, which later became an institute and later a university, Tuskegee, which is a very famous HBCU. He was the foremost black leader into the early 20th century, and he's probably most famous for a speech that's called the Atlanta Exposition Address, or the Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Atlanta Compromise speech in a minute, but I just want to get back to Booker T. Washington for just a moment. Now, one of the things that's really important about him is that he became the #1 spokesman for Black America. When white leaders wanted to deal with the black community, either on a political level or with something very important like passage of laws or with getting people elected, they always turned to Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington led a faction that we call today the Tuskegee Machine. So, for example, if you were a black person and you wanted a prominent job in government, whites would turn to Booker T. Washington and ask him for their advice on hiring you. So you couldn't get a job of any reasonable note or stature in the United States without first having to go through Booker T. Washington. So many black people, when they wanted these prominent jobs, they either went to visit him, wrote him a letter, made donations. So he became the wheel or the hub by which the black community circulated from the 1870s, 90s onward for about 20, 25 years. Now think about this for a moment. Here is a former black slave who is the first black person to have dinner in the White House. Remarkable. Now, the Atlanta Exposition Address, otherwise known as the Atlanta Compromise Speech in 1895, was important for these reasons. Booker T. Washington was asked to come give a speech at a sort of fair or a convention of cotton growers. And in this speech, he basically laid out a couple of things. First, there was a rising tide of European immigration into the United States. So Booker T. Washington wanted to tell white people not to hire these immigrants because these were foreigners, and to hire black people because while in slavery, the most trusted friend of white people were black people. We nursed their kids, we took care of their plantations and their homes. So Washington, in his mind, is fundamentally coming up with this idea that the way to go is for white people to rely on black labor. Now, we have to put this in context in the sense that this was the time period from the 1850s onwards into the 19-teens, the rise of America as an industrial power. Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefellers, Ford Motor Company, etc. We were moving towards becoming the world's leader in capital and industry. And Booker T. Washington had the foresight to understand that the business of America is business. He also said a number of interesting things that would ripple throughout white America and black America, and also provide the cannon fodder for Washington's detractors, and a large groundswell of people eventually became his enemies. One of the things that he said is that, one, black people who were striving to become political leaders ought to retreat from politics. And the reason he argued this is that you have to be able to learn how to crawl before you can run. That out of slavery, black people were just learning how to do basic fundamental things like learning how to read, how to manage themselves, how to take care of themselves. And so what Washington is arguing is that for the masses of black people who couldn't read and write, what's the point of going into politics? What black people needed to do, Washington argued, was to become wealthy. That, yes, white people may not respect you for the color of your skin, but they will respect you for your money. So from this particular aspect, Washington is arguing from an old known factor that we called self-help, that black people need to reach down and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So the goal here for Washington was for black people to start businesses, to be self-reliant, to not look for the American government for help. White people applauded wildly and cheered, because for white people, this was the problem. This was termed as what we called the Negro question, what to do about black people. So remember, at the end of slavery, there were nearly 4 million black people who were enslaved in this country, and they needed to be fed, housed, clothed, educated. This was a massive undertaking. And so what Washington is making the argument is that white people, you don't have to do any of that. We'll do it all ourselves. And this for white people, relieve them of the burden of having to deal with black people, but it also relieved them of the burden of having to compete with black people for politics and the spoils of politics, which is always money. Now, many of Washington's detractors called the Atlanta Exposition speech, as I stated, the Atlanta Compromise, because what they argued was that Booker T. Washington was compromising away black people's political rights, that we had a right to vote, to hold office, to decide how our tax dollars are being used, and for them, Washington was giving all of that away. So this is inherently the problem with the Atlanta Exposition Address and Booker T. Washington. There was Archibald Grimke, who was also a former slave, born in 1849, who was a Harvard lawyer. And one of the things that I find exceedingly interesting about reviewing this time period of the numbers of really super educated and competent black people there were in the world. Excuse me. Now, Grimke was a diplomat. He was a founder of a newspaper called The Guardian and an active member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. So Grimke is one of these individuals who fundamentally believed in the American enterprise, that black people were inherently Americans. Our next individual is a man by the name of Thomas T. Fortune, 1856 to 1928, who was also born into slavery, and he was the editor of the New York Age, which was a massively popular black newspaper. And Thomas T. Fortune was able to at least have access to the minds and hearts of black people through this newspaper, the New York Age. Now, counter to this group of assimilationists were a group of people that we now call Emigrationists. These were Martin Delany, Alexander Crummell, Henry Highland Garnett, Edward Blyden, and James T. Hawley. We're only going to talk about a couple of people here. We'll talk about Alexander Crummell and Edward Blyden, because I think that these are two of the most important of the Emigrationists. So Alexander Crummell was born in 1819 and died in 1898, and he was a minister of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was also a graduate of Cambridge University, and he eventually would immigrate to Africa, Liberia, as a matter of fact, which was one of the most talked about countries for the immigration of black people from the United States. Now, Alexander Crummell preached greatly of the fact that Africa was, in fact, our home, and that we as black people could not get a fair stake in the affairs of the United States. Edward Wilmot Blyden was actually born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and his most influential work, which was written in 1890, was called The Call of Providence to the Descendants of Africa in America. And within this, he made the argument that whites were so racist that we would never be able to get a fair shake in the United States. And he also advocated for the immigration to Liberia. And there are some very powerful words that Blyden wrote, and we'll just go over these right here. And he says, quoting, "We need some African power, some great center of the race where our physical, pecuniary, and intellectual strength may be collected. We need some spot where such an influence may go forth on behalf of the race as shall be felt by nations. We are so scattered and divided that we can do nothing." So there are two common threads here, and the one is that we just need a place where black people can collect ourselves and to begin to rebuild our lives, and also the fact of we are not united. And this would be a common thread during this time period, the unity of black people, not only in the United States, but in the world itself. Now, the next strand is the cultural nationalists. Now, many of these cultural nationalists also believed in the idea of assimilation. As a matter of fact, most of them did. They had this fundamental belief that Black Americans would constitute a nation within a nation. Now, this is a very interesting point of theory or philosophy in the fact that although Black people are Americans, that we are a distinct subset that we ought to be classified as having our own nation within the nation of our birth. Now, typically, it takes three things to have a nation. You need to have land, you need to have an economy, and you need to have a language. Black people speak the King's English. We have to involve ourselves in American capitalism, but we do have our own language. And we call this today Black slang or Black English, Ebonics, what have you. So then how can we become a nation within a nation if we're missing two of the three elements? Good question. Du Bois had an answer for that, and we'll get into him in just a minute. So here is our fundamental cultural nationalist and a vehement detractor or opponent of Booker T. Washington, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois was born in 1868, and he actually died on the day of the March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, received undergraduate degrees from Fisk and Harvard, almost finished a PhD at the University of Berlin, but the people who were paying his tuition pulled their resources from him and told him to come back and finish his degree at Harvard, which he did. So he earned a PhD from Harvard. He wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, which some people regard as the most important work in the 20th century. He was also an editor of the Crisis magazine, which was the magazine for the NAACP. And after Washington's death in 1915, he is the de facto leader of Black America. Du Bois published a number of works, everything from The Souls of Black Folk to Dark Water, Black Reconstruction, Dusk of Dawn, the Encyclopedia of the Negro, and of course, an autobiography, which was later posthumously published in 1968. Now, for Du Bois, he cannot accept the racial caste system that was articulated by Booker T. Washington. Although he was an assimilationist like Booker T. Washington, he couldn't accept the idea that Black people would forgo their political rights. He believed fundamentally that racism was destroying America. That for one, that racism was killing Black individuality, but it was also blinding white people. And the reason why Du Bois had argued that racism was killing Blacks' individuality is that Black people were spending an inordinate amount of time fighting against racism instead of really looking to see who they fundamentally are as people. He argued that a Black culture can stand on its own, that it is worthy and praised amongst the cultures of the world, and hence where the idea of cultural nationalism, and why Du Bois believed that Black culture is so distinct that we could see it ourselves as having a distinct American culture. In his work, The Souls of Black Folk, he has a couple of things that are worth talking about here because they have a lot to deal with politics. So we'll read this statement here that comes from a chapter of The Souls of Black Folk called Of Our Spiritual Strivings. And he writes, after the Egyptian, Indian, the Greek, the Roman, the Teuton, the Mongolian, the Negro is sort of a seventh son born with a veil. Now, what does he mean by this? Born with a veil. and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It's a peculiar sensation, Dubois argues, this sort of double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So let's go over this really quickly. So first of all, he's comparing us to other groups of the world, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, Teutons, Germans. And he says that when we are born in this country, we come with a veil. And what he means by a veil is the sort of the sheer garment that's worn over a woman's eyes in some countries. And what this veil does is it obscures the way that you see things and the way that people see you. And so he says that this veil then allows us to see the world from both being an African American or Negro at the time the word was used and an American. But what this also does is that it obscures our sight so that we can't really truly be true human beings because of this veil. Now, this veil is representative of racism. Now, what this veil does is that it splits the African American into two groups, one as an American and one as a black person, a Negro. And sometimes these two are at odds with each other. Think of assimilation and immigrationism. Black people fundamentally understood that there was so much racism in America that we did have to leave the United States. But we couldn't leave because we were Americans. So what we got for this is that we were hunted, lynched, murdered, raped within the United States because we had the opinion that this was the country of our birth. So from that particular standpoint, you can understand where Du Bois is coming from. These warring ideas. How can you have allegiance to a nation that doesn't like you? Michelle Obama gave a speech somewhere during Barack Obama's presidency. I think it was in the early stretches when she said something like, it's hard being a black American because sometimes America just doesn't love you back. And she was right about that. And that's exactly what Du Bois is talking about here. He's also talking about something that is fundamental as well, and the idea here that the veil itself is problematic for white people. That writing The Souls of Black Folk, what his goal was is to show white people their racism and what it's doing to black people. One, the veil denies you of true consciousness, so you only see yourself through others, not how you actually feel. Now, what's interesting about this is that while black people can see through the veil and see white people for who they are, Du Bois makes the argument that the veil robs whites of their humanity, and so that white people cannot see black people and who they are. That's why what Du Bois would argue is that white people know nothing about black people. And that why black people are mystified about why is it that white people simply don't know the community. Yeah, I think in some degree he was right about that. Then we have the political nationalists. These are in many ways akin to the cultural nationalists, and they have a lot in common, but sometimes, and particularly with the case of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who was a significant political nationalists, there is some tension and outright fighting. The political nationalists believe generally in immigration, and they pointed to Liberia as a place to immigrate, but they look towards Africa as being the home of black people. Some of them did not. Some of them were, in fact, assimilationists who fundamentally believed that black people ought to strive for its political rights in the United States, but that also we should stay here. The fundamental linkages between these two groups, whether you are an immigrationist or assimilationist, is that you believed in uniting the black diaspora for political purposes. And what we mean by the diaspora is that black people share something in common all over the globe, no matter where they are and who they are. Marcus Garvey is the most important of these political nationalists, born in 1887 in Jamaica, and he would die in June 10th, 1940, in London, England. He was head of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an organization he founded in Jamaica in 1914 and would later incorporate in the United States in 1918. He was the most significant, I believe, leader of the mid-20th century. I think he even eclipsed Dubois. His organization, the UNIA, had over 1 million dues-paying members worldwide. It's the largest organization that's ever been created anywhere in the world for black people. His fundamental philosophies and beliefs for the UNIA was that black people must return to Africa, and he largely pointed to Liberia. That black people also, taking a lead from Booker T. Washington, should become masters of industry. And that at every step we ought to challenge white supremacy, that Africa and African people are just as good as anyone else, and we needed to show them that we could become masters of politics, industry, culture, and refinement or civilization. Now, you've gotten a pretty good survey of black political thought from 1850, and there's so much more here that we couldn't cover, but this is generally the gist of it. And what people are striving for and asking are questions on black political life in America, how black people were going to get along after the Civil War. And so this is generally the overall synopsis or the strands of black political thought. So this ought to serve you well as we push forward through this semester. Okay, so there are other lectures that you'll need to listen to. Again, make sure that you take good notes. You're going to need this information for your final exam.